The forge hissed like a cornered snake. Sparks flew up into the blackness, each one a tiny, angry star against a moonless sky. A crowd was pressed shoulder to shoulder in the yard, their faces lit by the cruel dancing firelight. They weren't just watching. They were hungry. Their murmurs were sharp as knives. In the center of it all, Mara staggered. Her legs were bruised purple. Her arms were twisted behind her back by two hulking men, their grips like iron vices. Her face was swollen, her vision blurry from blows that had come without warning and without pause. She could taste blood. Nearby, her three little girls clung to each other by the corral fence. Their bodies were small, shaking things, and their sobs cut through the summer night like broken glass. They were the reason for all this. They were her shame. The patriarch of the Calder clan stood tall by the fire. He was a mountain of a man, with a gray beard and eyes as cold as river stones. He lifted the branding iron high, its tip glowing a furious, white-hot orange. The symbol was the Calder mark, a twisted knot of thorns. His shadow stretched long and wicked against the barn wall. "She is a curse," he thundered, and his voice rang through the silence that fell over the yard. The murmurs stopped. The sobs hitched. Every eye was on him. Every eye was on Mara. "Three times she birthed," he roared, pointing the glowing iron at her. "And three times she gave this clan only daughters. Weak flesh when we needed heirs to hold this land." He took a step closer. The heat from the iron washed over Mara's face. "And for that shame, she will be marked. So every man, woman, and child knows what a wasted womb looks like." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Some faces turned away, unable to watch, but more leaned closer, their morbid curiosity a beast that had to be fed. Pity was a luxury no one in this valley could afford. Mara's knees buckled. Terror and despair were a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. A scream built in her throat, but it was strangled by the rough hands that shoved her forward, forcing her toward the thick wooden post set in the center of the yard. Her daughters shrieked as their mother stumbled. Ela, the eldest, just 7 years old, broke from her sisters. She ran, her little legs pumping through the dirt. "Mama!" she cried, her voice a tiny, desperate sound in the suffocating tension. A meaty hand shoved her back, hard. She fell, her knees scraping raw on the packed earth. She didn't cry out, just stared, her eyes wide with a horror no child should ever know. The crowd hissed, a low, ugly sound. Their cruelty was dressed up as tradition, but it was still just cruelty. The patriarch's lips curled into a sneer of satisfaction. He was judge, jury, and executioner, and he loved the role. "Hold her steady," he barked at the men holding Mara. The iron lowered. The heat was a living thing now, shimmering in the air, cooking the sweat on Mara's skin. It came within inches of her cheek. She could smell her own hair starting to singe. She closed her eyes, waiting for the searing pain that would mark her forever. And then a voice cut across the square. It was calm. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. "Let her go." Every head turned. The crowd parted like water before a ship's bow. A figure stepped out from the deep shadows at the edge of the yard, a place where the firelight didn't reach. It was Cole Rafferty. He was the rancher who lived alone on the far ridge, a man spoken of only in whispers. He walked with deliberate steps, his boots crunching softly in the dust. His broad frame was a silhouette against the fire, towering and solid. The brim of his hat cast his face in shadow, but you could feel his eyes. They burned like black coals, and they weren't fixed on the patriarch or the glowing iron. They were fixed on the three trembling children huddled in the dirt. A new murmur rippled through the onlookers, this one laced with fear. Cole Rafferty was a ghost. Years ago, he had buried his wife and his young son. They died in a barn fire, a fire that everyone whispered had Calder hands all over it. Since that day, Cole had spoken little. His grief was an armor he never took off. The patriarch snarled, his authority challenged. He swung the iron closer to Mara's skin, so close she flinched from the heat. "This is Calder justice, Rafferty. This is our business. Ride on, unless you are eager to share her mark." Cole didn't stop until he was just a step away. His shoulders were squared, a wall of silent defiance. The air grew thick, heavy as thunder clouds just before a storm breaks. The silence stretched. Then he spoke, his voice slow, sharp, and cutting. "If branding's your justice," he said, his gaze finally flicking to the patriarch's cold eyes, "then brand me, not her." A collective gasp tore from the crowd. The silence that followed was so stark, so absolute, it felt like even the forge had stopped breathing. The patriarch's sneer twisted into a mask of pure fury. His hand, the one holding the iron, trembled with rage. "You'd take her shame onto yourself? A barren woman's mark?" Cole's gaze never wavered. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he reached down to Ela, the little girl who had tried to run to her mother. He lifted her gently to her feet, his large calloused hands brushing the dirt from her scraped knees with a touch so tender, so unexpected, that the girl just blinked up at him in stunned silence. "She's carried enough," Cole said, his voice rough but steady as a rock. He looked straight at Mara, then at her daughters. "From this night on, those girls are mine to raise, and no hand will ever touch them, or their mother, again." Mara's tears, held back by terror, finally spilled. They ran hot down her bruised cheeks. Her body, which had been rigid with fear, suddenly sagged. The words sank into her heart, a tiny seed of impossible hope in a barren field of despair. The crowd buzzed, shock and fear colliding. The iron glowed brighter. The night hung on the razor's edge of fire and blood. But that wasn't the twist. Not yet. The patriarch's face contorted, spittle flying from his lips as he barked an order. "Seize him! Let the fool wear the mark, and then we'll finish the girl." His men, a knot of broad-shouldered brutes with ropes and knives glinting in the firelight, surged forward. Mara screamed as they closed in on Cole. But Cole moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a storm breaking loose. The first man reached him. Cole's fist cracked across the man's jaw with the sound of a tree splitting in a lightning strike. The brute went down, sprawling into the dirt, out cold. Another man swung a thick rope, aiming to ensnare him. Cole seized it midair, yanking the man clean off his feet before driving a heavy boot into his gut. The man crumpled, gasping for air. Chaos erupted. Shouts echoed across the yard. Women in the crowd shrieked, pulling their children back as the space in front of the forge became a battlefield. The patriarch, enraged, forgot all reason. He swung the branding iron wildly, lunging not at Cole, but back toward Mara, its heat searing the night air. He was going to mark her anyway. But Cole's hand shot out like a striking snake, catching the patriarch's wrist in a grip of steel. With a savage twist, he wrenched it aside. The iron clattered into the dirt, spitting sparks, but not before the glowing, thorny symbol pressed flat against the back of the patriarch's own hand. A horrifying sizzle filled the air, the smell of scorched flesh. The patriarch howled, a sound of pure agony, stumbling back and clutching his own burned hand. He had been marked by his own weapon. "You'll regret this, Rafferty," he roared, his face pale with shock and pain. Cole shoved him backward, sending the old man stumbling into his own men. Cole's voice was like rolling thunder. "The only shame here is yours." But the fight was just beginning. The rest of the Calder's men piled on, tackling Cole from all sides. They were a swarm of fists and boots. Fists hammered his ribs. Boots slammed into his legs. Blood spattered across the dust as they dragged him down. Mara cried out, straining against the men who still held her, watching as the man who had just saved her now buckled under their sheer weight. "Stop! Please stop!" she sobbed, her voice breaking. But no mercy came. They were going to beat him to death, right there in front of her. Then Ela, her eldest, who had been watching with wide, terrified eyes, broke free from her sisters again. This time she didn't run. She stood small and defiant, and her voice, though tiny, pierced the chaos. "Leave him alone," she screamed. "He's our papa now." The words struck like a church bell, silencing the mob for a single, stunned heartbeat. In that silence, Cole, bloodied and staggering, lifted his head, his eyes burning through a curtain of his own blood, found the little girl. A roar tore from his throat, a sound born of years of buried grief and fresh fury. He tore himself free from the pile of men, his fists crashing into skulls, sending bodies flying. And then something else happened. With a hiss of oiled steel, a heavy chain snapped free from his belt. It wasn't a work chain. It was thick, with heavy links, a weapon. The chain whipped through the air, a blur of dark metal. It struck a Calder man across the face, splitting skin and bone. The man dropped without a sound. Cole spun, the chain looping around another man's wrist, and with a brutal yank, he pulled him, screaming into the dirt. The crowd recoiled in terror. This wasn't a simple rancher. Cole fought like a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. Every blow was fueled by the ghosts of a family lost to fire, by promises he had failed to keep. Mara's tears blurred her vision, but in that storm of fists and blood, she saw more than just violence. She saw a vow being made flesh. The patriarch scrambled backward, clutching his burned hand, his voice shrill with pain and rage. "You'll bring ruin on yourself, Rafferty. You'll never stand against Calder blood." Cole planted his boots in the dust, the chain dripping with blood, his chest heaving. His voice carried through the smoke and cries, steady as stone. "Blood don't make a man," he said, his eyes finding Mara's. "Choice does, and I've chosen them." The crowd murmured, uneasy now. Some faces showed shame, others pure fury. Mara sagged to her knees, pulling her daughters into her arms, their small bodies trembling against hers. The forge crackled. The forgotten iron hissed in the dirt. And the night seemed to hold its breath as the Calders stumbled back to regroup, their confidence shattered. Cole wiped the blood from his eyes with the back of his hand, his voice rough as gravel. "This fight's just begun." The yard still stank of smoke and blood. The branding iron lay hissing faintly where it had fallen, a forgotten serpent in the dirt. The crowd had scattered to the edges of the firelight, their murmurs rippling through the dark like an uneasy wind. Some were shaken by the brutality. Others were just eager for more violence. Mara clutched her daughters, her torn dress a poor shield against the hate in the air. Her body trembled as she watched Cole Rafferty stand his ground. Blood dripped from a cut on his temple, and his chain hung limp but ready in his hand. Across from him, the Calder patriarch cradled his burned wrist, his eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated hate. "You've always been a curse on this valley, Rafferty," he spat, his voice raw with pain. "Lost your wife, lost your boy, and now you'd steal what isn't yours just to try and fill the hole in your soul. You're nothing but ash, pretending to be fire." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was a low blow, even for a Calder. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes snapped to Cole's battered face. Lost his wife. Lost his boy. The whispers were true. Her heart pounded with a new kind of fear, but also a dawning, terrible understanding. Cole's jaw tightened. The silence that followed was heavier than steel. For a moment it seemed the patriarch's words had found their mark, that he had broken through the armor of grief. Then Cole raised his head, and for the first time, his voice broke, just a little. It was rough, but it carried across the yard, his grief cutting the night more deeply than any blade. "A curse?" His eyes burned black in the torchlight. "The only curse here is Calder greed." He took a step forward. The remaining Calder men tensed. "The night your men came for my land," Cole's voice grew stronger, each word a hammer blow of truth. "You thought burning my barn was just business, a way to scare me off. You thought the fire would only take cattle and fence posts." His voice dropped to a near whisper, but it was more powerful than any shout. "But my wife and son were inside that barn, and you watched it burn from the ridge." Mara gasped, her knees giving way. She sank into the dirt, the strength gone from her legs. The crowd stirred, the whispers spreading like sparks in dry grass. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was an accusation, thrown in the patriarch's face in front of the whole valley. Some people covered their mouths, others looked away, their faces etched with a shame they had ignored for years. The patriarch's sneer faltered. Fear flickered in his eyes, but he quickly covered it with rage. They were weak. They weren't fit to carry this land. Cole stepped forward again, his chest heaving, every word dragging up years of agony he had buried in silence. "I buried them with my own hand," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I swore on their graves that no other mother, no other child would be left to fire and fists while men like you call it justice." He turned his burning gaze on Mara and her girls. That vow is why I stand here tonight. The truth struck Mara like a bolt of lightning. This man wasn't just saving her out of pity. He wasn't a stranger stepping in. He carried scars as deep as her own, wounds that had been burned right into his soul. Her youngest daughter whimpered, clutching tighter at her skirt, but Mara's hand was steady as she pressed it to her daughter's hair. Her voice was a low whisper of awe. He knows, babies. He knows what it is to lose. The patriarch's face twisted, his rage a mask for his growing fear. The valley was turning against him. He could feel it. He lifted his good hand, signaling his men who were still mounted at the gate. Then you'll bury these ones too, Rafferty, he shrieked. Every girl, every wretch you claim. We will grind them into the dirt until even your vow is nothing but ash. Mara screamed as the riders at the gate spurred their horses forward. Rifles glinted under the torchlight. The girls shrieked, clutching her skirts, their small faces buried in her dress. Cole's voice boomed over the din, as steady and unshakable as a vow forged in hellfire. You will not lay a hand on them. He whipped his chain high, its steel hissing through the air. The first rifle shot rang out. Sparks showered from the forge. From the dark ridges surrounding the valley, a single howl answered. Then another, and another. Wolves. The night erupted once more into fire and blood. The first rifle shot cracked the night, and a chunk of wood exploded from the corral post, just inches from Mara's head. She dropped to her knees, instinctively pulling her daughters down with her, shielding them with her own body as gunfire erupted from all sides. The square exploded into pure chaos. Horses screamed and reared. Torches were toppled, rolling across the dry ground, spreading small fires that licked at the edges of the chaos. Thick, acrid smoke poured across the yard, blurring everything into a nightmarish dance of firelight and shadow. Cole Rafferty charged forward like a storm unchained. His chain was a living thing, a blur of metal that whipped across a gunman's face, dropping him in a spray of blood before he could even aim. Another rider raised his rifle, but Cole's fist slammed the weapon aside. The barrel exploded, firing harmlessly into the dirt, before he wrenched the man from the saddle and threw him into the path of another charging horse. Mara tried to move, to drag the girls to safety, but the crowd, now a panicked mob, pressed in around them. They were a crush of jeering, terrified faces, twisted with a sick mix of fear and fury. She screamed as a Calder brute lunged through the mob, his eyes wild, and seized her wrist. He was going to drag her back to the post, but before he could, a howl split the night. It wasn't distant this time. It was close, terrifyingly close. Every head, friend and foe alike, turned toward the ridge, and out of the darkness they came. Wolves, a dozen of them, maybe more. Their eyes were like green fire under the moon, their massive forms moving like liquid shadows. Their voices rose together in a hunting chorus that shook the very marrow in every soul present. The mob broke. Screams of terror ripped through the air as men stumbled over each other to get away. Horses, smelling the predators, reared and bolted, trampling anything in their path. The Calder riders cursed in terror as the first wolf, a huge gray male, leaped into the fray. Its teeth sank into a rider's leg, and it dragged him, screaming, from the saddle. His cries were cut short in a terrifying tangle of snarls and blood. More wolves poured through the gate, not randomly, but with a terrifying intelligence. They circled the forge, their growls like thunder rolling through the smoke, cutting off the Calders from Mara and Cole. Mara froze, clutching her daughters, her mind torn between primal fear and utter awe. Her eldest daughter whimpered, "Mama, they'll eat us." But Mara shook her head, her voice trembling with a realization that defied all logic. "No, baby. They came for him." And they had. Cole stood at the center of the storm, a lone man surrounded by a whirlwind of fur and teeth. The wolves darted past his legs, never touching him, but snapping and tearing at every Calder man who dared to approach. For a heartbeat, it looked like he was commanding them, his chain whistling through the air in perfect, deadly concert with their howls. The patriarch, who had taken cover behind a water trough, scrambled to his feet. He waved his burned hand wildly, his face a mask of insane fury. "Shoot them all! Shoot the wolves and the man alike!" But his men were faltering. Their shots went wild. Their courage, built on bullying and numbers, splintered in the face of this primal, supernatural assault. A wolf leaped, knocking a gunman's rifle from his hands and into the fire. Another tore at a man's boot until he screamed and fled into the night, abandoning his horse and his weapon. Mara seized the moment. She grabbed her girls, dragging them toward the now-fallen gate, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cole fought his way to her side, a guardian angel forged in blood and grit. His shirt was soaked in crimson. His face was a mask of dirt and sweat, but his eyes burned with a relentless, protective fire. "Go!" he barked, snatching up the youngest girl, who had started to cry, into his arms. His other hand gripped Mara's wrist, his touch firm and reassuring. Together they ran. The wolves cleared a path for them, a living, snarling corridor through the panicked men. The night was alive with snarls and screams behind them. The patriarch's voice shrieked curses that were swallowed by the din. They didn't look back. They burst through the gate and into the open land, the cold night air searing Mara's lungs. Cole stumbled, his wounds taking their toll, but he didn't fall. He drove them onward, down the slope, toward the dark creek bed where the shadows would give them cover. The wolves fanned out around them, a royal guard of silent shadows. Their green eyes flashed in the darkness, and their howls, once a sound of terror, were now a shield. Only when the gunfire and screams faded into the distance did they finally stop. They collapsed into the shallows of the creek, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Mara pressed her daughters close, finally letting her own sobs break free. Cole knelt in the cool water, letting it wash the blood from a deep gash in his side. His voice came out hoarse, raw, but steady. "They won't stop, Mara. The Calders will hunt us till one of us is in the ground." She met his eyes. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her chest. But something else, something stronger, was rising to meet it. It was a fire he had ignited. "Then we fight," she whispered, her daughters clutching tighter at her skirts, hearing the iron in her voice. From the ridge high above them, the wolves howled again, their song rolling across the valley like an oath carried on the wind. The sun clawed its way over the horizon, bleeding red and orange across the silent valley. Cole led them through a narrow rocky ravine. His steps were slow, deliberate, unbroken, despite the blood that had soaked through the makeshift bandage on his side. The wolves shadowed them from the high ridge above. Their silhouettes were fleeting things in the gray dawn light. They weren't tame, not pets. They were tethered to him by something older and deeper than words. Mara's arms ached from carrying her middle child, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. Her bare feet were cut and bruised on the sharp rocks, but she didn't complain. Every painful step away from the Calder yard was another heartbeat of survival. When they finally crested the last ridge, she stopped, her breath caught in her throat at the sight below. Ruins. The skeleton of a homestead sprawled across a sun-bleached clearing. The barn was nothing but blackened ribs of timber reaching for the sky. The house was a ghost, a collection of charred beams and fallen stone. Only the stone chimney still stood tall and defiant, a lonely gravestone marking a fire long past. Mara turned to Cole, her voice a low whisper. "This was yours?" He nodded once, his face hidden in the shadow beneath the brim of his battered hat. "All I had," he said, his voice flat. "All they took." He walked stiffly down into the ruins, his boots crunching on old ash and charcoal. He went to a spot near the chimney and pushed aside a heavy, fallen beam. Underneath was a thick cellar door, its iron hinges rusted but still intact. He heaved it open. A wave of cool, dry, stale air wafted out. "You and the girls stay down here," he said, his voice practical, pushing aside the grief the place held. "If the fight comes here, stone walls don't burn." Mara's throat tightened. Her gaze darted from the blackened wood to the girls clinging to her skirt. "You built this once, and they burned it down," she said, her voice filled with a terrible certainty. "You'll bleed yourself dry trying to hold it again. They'll just burn it with us in it." Cole's eyes, dark and unflinching, lifted to meet hers. There was no argument in them, only a quiet, terrible finality. "I swore on their graves," he said softly, "that no fire would take another mother and her children. Not while I still breathe. His words landed with the weight of granite. It wasn't a boast. It was a vow, a fact, like the rising of the sun. Mara felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. Beneath her fear, a fragile new feeling flickered to life. Trust. A belief that this man would not bend, would not break, not even in the face of his own death. So they began to work. Together they started to rebuild what little they could, to turn this grave into a fortress. Cole, despite the wounds that pulled at his body with every movement, stacked fallen stones into crude barricades at the choke points of the trail. He laid out traps made of rope and sharpened sticks, his hands steady and sure. Mara gathered firewood and fetched water from a hidden spring Cole showed her. Her daughters, seeing their mother work, began to help. They fetched small stones in their skirts and carried bundles of dry brush. Their childish determination was etched on their tired, soot-stained faces. And for the first time, Mara looked at her daughters and saw not a curse, but a strength she had never recognized. Their small hands were building a wall against the cruelty that had hunted them their entire lives. When the work slowed for a moment, Cole crouched beside Ella, the eldest. He pressed a small, smooth carving of a wolf into her hand. It was worn smooth from years of being held. "Keep this close," he said softly. "It belonged to my boy. He believed wolves never abandoned their own." The girl's eyes, so full of fear just hours before, shone with a new light. She clutched the small wooden wolf to her chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Mara had to turn away, her chest aching with a complex mix of sorrow for his loss and a gratitude so profound it felt like pain. He was giving her child a piece of the son he had lost, a piece of his own broken heart. As the sun dipped again toward the west, casting long shadows across their makeshift defenses, a thin plume of smoke rose on the distant horizon. Not from the homestead, from the valley below. Cole's jaw tightened as he studied it, the muscles in his neck rigid. "They're regrouping," he said, his voice low and grim. "They'll be here by nightfall." Mara pulled her daughters close, her own voice steady despite the cold dread that washed over her. "Then they'll find us ready." As if in answer, a lone wolf howled from the ridge above them. Then another joined in. Their howls carried on the wind like a battle hymn. The ruined homestead, once a monument to loss, now stood braced for war. Cole gripped the rifle he'd pulled from the cellar, the firelight of memory burning in his eyes. "This place took everything from me once," he said, his voice a low growl. "Tonight, it gives me the ground to stand." The sun bled out behind the ridge, leaving the world cloaked in a deep, purple twilight. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of wood smoke drifting up from the distant Calder campfires. Mara crouched at the cellar door. Her daughters were huddled inside the small, stone-walled hollow, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering flame of a single lantern she had set on an old crate. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear she tried desperately to hide. She kissed each of their foreheads. "No matter what you hear, you stay quiet." Their little hands clung to her dress, their knuckles white. They didn't want to let her go, but she forced herself to pull away, to close the heavy cellar door over them. Her heart felt like it was splitting in two as the latch clicked shut. Outside, the ruined homestead breathed with a tense, waiting silence. Cole was crouched near the base of the stone chimney, his rifle balanced across his knees. His chain was coiled at his side like a serpent, ready to strike. The wolves, their forms now just darker shadows in the deepening gloom, paced the perimeter of the clearing. Their glowing green eyes cut through the dark. Their low growls were a constant, rolling threat, a sound that vibrated in the very ground. Cole's breath was ragged, his shirt stiff with his own dried blood, but his gaze was as steady as the North Star. It was fixed on the narrow trail that snaked its way up the ridge. "They'll come hard, Hina," he said, his voice a low rumble, like gravel dragged across stone. Mara knelt beside him. Her hands trembled as she checked the action on the old pistol he had thrust into her palm earlier. It was heavy, unfamiliar. "And we'll answer harder," she replied, surprising even herself with the steel in her tone. Cole gave her a quick, sidelong look. For a single heartbeat, the last rays of twilight revealed a flicker of something in his weary eyes. It looked like pride. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, a distant drumming, then growing louder, rumbling like the drums of war. From beneath the ground, from inside the cellar, came the muffled cries of her daughters as the night itself began to tremble. Torches flared to life on the ridge, a line of riders, silhouetted like devils against the last of the starlight. Their shadows were long and jagged as they poured down the trail toward the homestead. Mara's breath caught in her throat. There were so many. The Calder men fanned out at the edge of the clearing, their rifles gleaming in the torchlight. Their shouts, brutal and eager, carried across the valley. The brute who had taken command after the patriarch fell, a man with a scarred face and a feral grin, rode at their head. "Burn them out!" he bellowed, his voice splitting the night. Torches arced through the air like dying comets. They landed in the blackened timbers of the old barn, in the collapsed roof of the house. Flames licked greedily at the dry, ancient wood. Smoke rose, acrid and thick, curling around the stone walls like a strangler's grip. The wolves howled in answer, a sound of pure, primal fury that made even the most hardened riders falter. Their horses reared, their eyes rolling in terror. Then the first shot cracked. But it wasn't from the Calders. One of their riflemen, perched on a rock for a clear shot, simply dropped. Cole's bullet tore him from his perch before he could even aim. Mara lifted her pistol. Her arms trembled, but her resolve was firm. She aimed at the nearest shadow, a man lighting another torch, and fired. The recoil jolted her bones. The man screamed, clutching his shoulder, spinning away from his horse. The battle roared to life. Wolves lunged from the darkness, a storm of gray fur and flashing teeth. They dragged riders from their saddles, their vicious snarls tearing through the smoke-filled air. Cole's chain snapped through the night. It wrapped around a man's throat, yanking him from his horse with a sickening crack. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence. Mara pressed herself against the stone wall of the chimney, firing until her pistol clicked empty. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Cole fight with a ferocity born of loss and fueled by his vow. But the Calders kept coming, an endless tide of them. More torches were flung, more rifles spat fire. The flames roared higher, lighting the ruins like a funeral pyre for the entire world. The brute leader, seeing his men falter against the wolves and Cole's deadly aim, dismounted. He charged forward on foot, a torch in one hand and a long blade in the other. His eyes were fixed, not on Cole, but on the cellar door. Mara's heart froze in her chest. "The girls!" she gasped, surging to her feet, all thoughts of her own safety gone. Cole staggered, blood dripping from a fresh wound in his side, but he moved to block the brute's path. His voice was a low, animalistic growl. "You'll not touch them." The brute's sneer gleamed in the firelight, a terrifying sight. "Then I'll carve you first, Rafferty." The two men collided in the heart of the flames as the wolves howled, and the valley burned around them. The flames leaped higher, licking at the night sky, sending sparks spinning like a storm of fiery stars. The ruins of Cole's home roared alive again, a hell of smoke and chaos. The brute leader crashed into Cole with the force of a battering ram. His torch fell, forgotten, to the dirt as his long blade slashed across the rancher's arm. Cole grunted, his jaw clenched against the searing pain, but his chain lashed out instantly. It wrapped around the brute's wrist, yanking it back with brutal force. Steel clattered against stone as the two men grappled in the flickering, hellish light, their shadows dancing like giant warring specters against the chimney. Wolves circled the fight, their snarls splitting the dark as they continued to drag down Calder riders. But still, the enemy pressed closer, relentless. The smoke was blinding. The constant crack of gunfire was like endless thunder. Mara's chest burned with every breath. She frantically searched for another weapon. Anything. Her pistol was empty. Her hands, trembling with adrenaline, closed around something hard and metal half buried in the ash. An axe head. She yanked it free, a shower of old ash falling from its rusted edge. Without a moment's hesitation, she swung it with all her might into the path of a rider who had dismounted and was rushing the cellar. The man fell with a howl, clutching a mangled leg. Mara stood over him, the axe head held ready, her voice cracking with a rage she didn't know she possessed. "You won't take them!" Her daughter's muffled sobs drifted up through the earth beneath her feet. Their fear was a fire in her blood, pushing her past exhaustion, past terror. In the heart of the fire, Cole staggered. The brute landed a savage blow to his already injured ribs, and the chain slipped from Cole's blood-slicked grasp. The leader's grin was cruel, his eyes gleaming in the fire's glow. "You'll bleed out just like your family burned," he snarled, pressing Cole back, step by step, against the hot stone of the chimney. For a single terrible heartbeat, despair clawed at Mara's chest. They were going to lose. He was going to die. But then Cole's voice broke out, raw and thunderous, his vow carrying through the crackling flames. "I swore no child would be left to fire again. Not while I breathe." With a surge of strength born from the graves of his family, he slammed his forehead into the brute's nose. Bone crunched, blood sprayed. The brute staggered back, stunned, his eyes wide with shock. It was the opening Cole needed. He seized the chain again, wrapping it around the man's throat, and pulled. He pulled until the man's screams choked into a desperate, gurgling silence. The rest of the Calder men faltered at the sight, their leader collapsing in the dirt like a puppet with its strings cut. The wolves lunged into their hesitation. They became a gray tide of fury, scattering horses, snapping at heels, their howls echoing like a final judgment. Mara rushed to Cole's side. Her hands caught his arm as he nearly collapsed against the chimney. Blood was now streaming from the gash in his side. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. But his eyes, when they met hers, still burned with an unbroken fire. "You can't stand," she whispered, her voice cut with fear. "You'll die if you keep fighting." Cole's gaze flicked to the cellar door, to the trembling sobs that came from beneath it, and then back to her. "Then I'll die keeping my vow," he rasped. As if on cue, another wave of Calder men, their courage bolstered by desperation, charged through the smoke, their torches and blades flashing. Mara raised the axe, her arms trembling with exhaustion, but her stance was unshaken. She was ready to fall beside him. Cole lifted his rifle with hands slick with his own blood. He chambered around. Every shot he fired into the dark was fueled by the ghosts of his wife and son, by the promise he had made in the square, by the new family huddled in the earth beneath him. The wolves answered his rifle shots with a chorus of howls, their bodies weaving between man and flame, a pack of guardians born of the wild. The enemy broke against them like waves on a stone shore. But Mara knew this was only the eye of the storm. The night stretched on, endless, and the cost of survival was climbing higher with every breath. She pressed closer to Cole, her voice steady despite the smoke stinging her eyes. "Then we fight together for them." Cole's eyes softened, if only for a heartbeat. Then they hardened again as he aimed the rifle. "For them!" The flames roared higher, shadows twisted across the ridge, and the night bled on, a symphony of fire and fury, as the vow written in blood carried them deeper into the storm. The night howled. It was a living entity of smoke and fury. The very ruins trembled beneath the weight of gunfire, the screams of dying men, and the relentless snarls of the wolves. Cole was staggering now, leaning heavily on the chimney for support. Blood soaked the dirt around his feet, but his rifle still barked into the dark, each shot felling another shadow that dared to come too close. Mara's chest heaved. She swung the axe again, and the handle, old and dry, finally split under the force of her desperate strike. The Calder man crumpled at her feet. She was weaponless again. But for every rider that fell, two more seemed to press forward, their torches blazing, their rage unbroken by their losses. Then Mara's heart stopped. It simply ceased to beat. One of the riders, seeing an opening, broke through the wolves' deadly circle. He spurred his horse mercilessly, charging straight for the cellar hatch, where her daughters cowered in the dark beneath the ground. "No!" she screamed. Her legs were pumping before her mind even caught up, but the distance stretched before her like a cruel, impossible rope, pulling tighter with every second. The rider leaped from his saddle, his boots pounding the earth as he reached for the iron latch, his torch raised high to light his work. Cole saw it too. He tried to move, to intercept. "Mara!" he yelled, his voice raw. But he stumbled, his knees finally buckling under the blood loss, dragging him down. He was too far away, too wounded. Mara surged forward, her arms burning, her lungs on fire, her voice a ragged plea. "Stay away from them!" She hurled her body at the rider just as his hand gripped the cellar latch. They crashed into the dirt together. The torch tumbled away, spitting sparks across the dry brush, starting new, smaller fires. The rider's knife gleamed in the firelight. It slashed across her arm, but Mara's hands found his wrist, and she wrestled with a strength she never knew she had, a strength pulled from pure terror and a mother's love. The cellar door rattled as little fists pounded on it from the inside. The girl's cries were muffled, but they pierced her heart. The rider snarled, driving her back, his superior weight overpowering her. The knife descended toward her throat, and then a wolf lunged from the shadows. It slammed into him from the side, a silent gray missile of teeth and fury. Its teeth tore into his shoulder. He screamed, a high, panicked sound, and the knife spun from his grip. Mara seized it. Her own scream, a sound of rage and grief and terror, tore from her throat as she drove the blade into his chest. Blood sprayed hot across her face. His body went limp, collapsing on top of her. For a moment, all she could hear was her own ragged breath in the frantic pounding of her daughter's fists beneath the hatch. Cole dragged himself forward, his chain clutched weakly in one hand. His face was white with pain, but his eyes burned as he saw what she had done. He reached her side, his voice a raw whisper. "You saved them." Mara was shaking, her hands slick with the man's blood, her chest heaving with sobs. "No," she whispered, her gaze darting to the wolves that were now circling tighter around the homestead, a protective, snarling wall. "We saved them." But the danger wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Flames now licked higher across the ruins, spreading with terrifying speed toward the wooden cellar hatch. Sparks rained down like burning snow as the smoke choked the night. And then a new figure appeared on the ridge. It was the patriarch himself. His burned hand was bound in bloody rags. His eyes were wild with hate. He had returned to watch them die. "Burn them all!" he shrieked, his voice carrying on the wind. "Let the fire eat what the wolves cannot." At his command, more torches arced through the sky. They landed across the remaining roof beams above the cellar. The flames roared hotter, a hungry beast closing in on the one small sanctuary left. Cole pushed himself upright with a pained grunt. His knees trembled. His chest rose and fell like a man standing on the very edge of death. "They want fire!" His voice cracked but carried as hard as stone. "Then we'll turn it against them." He dragged Mara toward the old water trough. He sloshed what little water remained onto strips of cloth and threw them across the cellar hatch, his trembling hands somehow steady in their purpose. The wolves darted into the edges of the fire, scattering riders, but the blaze itself kept growing. It was a living thing now, a monster that threatened to consume everything. Mara clutched Cole's arm, her voice a desperate whisper. "We can't hold on much longer." He looked down at her, then at the cellar door where her daughter's cries were rising in panic, and for the first time, his face softened through the layers of soot and blood. "Then I'll bleed every drop I've got left," he said quietly, buying them one more breath. The fire roared closer. The patriarch's insane laughter carried on the wind, and the vow forged in blood burned hotter than the flames themselves. The ruins blazed like a massive funeral pyre. The air was so thick with smoke it felt like drowning. It clawed at the lungs and stung the eyes. The very ground glowed with embers. Mara pressed herself against the stone chimney, her arm a raw, burning line of pain from the knife cut. Her chest heaved as she shielded the cellar door with her own body. Her daughter's cries from beneath the hatch rose with every loud snap of the flames, their terror a physical knife in her heart. The wolves who still circled the burning yard, their howls rising above the deafening crackle of the fire. They lunged at every Calder man who dared remain, dragging them into the darkness, scattering their horses into the smoke. But still the Calders pressed on, driven now not by courage, but by the will of the man who now strode into the blaze itself. The patriarch stepped out of the smoke. His burned hand was swathed in blood-soaked cloth. His eyes were blazing with a terrifying, ecstatic madness. The firelight licked at his face, making it look hollow and sharp, every wrinkle carved deeper by pure hate. He carried a rifle in his good hand, its weight steady despite his age, and a fresh torch in the other, its flames twisting like a demon in the wind. "Rafferty!" he roared, his voice cracking, but loud enough to cut through the roar of the battle. "You think yourself a savior, but you're just another fool who will burn like the rest." Cole staggered from behind the water trough. His body was sagging with blood loss, his face a pale gray beneath the soot. But when he stood up, the weight of his vow seemed to straighten his shoulders. His chain dragged like a dead serpent through the dirt. His voice carried, hoarse but unbroken. "You burned my family once. You won't touch another." The patriarch sneered, his torch flaring higher. "Then come into the fire and let it finish what it started." With a roar, he charged. His rifle bucked once in his hand. The bullet grazed Cole's arm, tearing a fresh line of blood across his sleeve. Cole stumbled, but he pressed forward, swinging his chain in a wide, desperate arc. The heavy links whistled through the smoke and smashed the torch from the patriarch's hand. Flames hissed across the dirt, and sparks rose like angry stars. The two men crashed together, a tangle of steel and chain and fists, colliding in the heart of the blaze. Mara screamed as the patriarch rammed Cole back against the hot stone of the chimney, pressing the rifle barrel up under his jaw. "Your vow dies with you," he spat, his breath rank with smoke and blood. Cole's eyes burned like black holes in the firelight. His voice was low, but steady as the stone at his back. "Then I'll die keeping it." With a final impossible surge of strength, a strength pulled from the graves of his wife and son, from the desperate cries of the girls beneath the hatch, from the faith he saw in Mara's trembling hands, he wrenched the rifle aside. The shot tore harmlessly into the night sky. His chain looped around the patriarch's arm, and he twisted until bone cracked. The old man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. The fire roared around them. The wolves howled like spirits of vengeance, their eyes glowing green in the swirling smoke. The patriarch clawed at Cole's face, his teeth bared like a cornered animal. But Cole drove him back, step by step, deeper into the burning ruins. The chain tightened with every breath. Mara's voice broke through the crackle of the flames. "Cole, don't! He'll kill you!" But Cole didn't falter. His eyes were fixed on the man who had taken everything from him, who now threatened to take everything again. "No more graves," he growled, his voice like thunder. "No more fire." With a final brutal wrench, he hurled the patriarch into the heart of the flames. The old man's scream split the night. His body was consumed in the blaze he had unleashed. His shadow writhed against the smoke for a moment, and then it was gone. Cole sagged. The chain slipped from his limp hand. His knees buckled, and he collapsed as the firelight danced across his battered face. Mara rushed to him, catching his arm as his blood poured freely onto the ash, his breath coming in ragged, shallow rasps. "Don't you leave us now," she whispered, her tears falling hot against his soot-streaked skin. He managed a faint, broken smile. His eyes glanced toward the cellar door, where the girls were now crying his name. "Not while they still need a father." The wolves howled one last time, their song rolling over the burning valley like a hymn of final judgment. Smoke curled into the pale horizon as the first light of dawn broke over the valley. The fire in the ruins had finally died down, hissing and spitting as it collapsed into glowing embers. The air was sharp with the smell of ash and blood. But for the first time in an endless night, a profound silence fell across the land. The wolves lingered on the ridge for a moment, their green eyes fading as they slipped back into the wild, their task done. Their howls echoed one last time, like a benediction, before the trees swallowed them whole. Mara pushed open the cellar door. Her arms trembled as she pulled her daughters out into the smoky morning light. Their little faces were streaked with tears and soot, but their eyes were bright, alive. They clung to her skirts as if they were afraid the night might rise again from the ashes. Cole sat slumped against the stone chimney. His shirt was black with dried blood. His breath was ragged, but it was steady. His chain lay beside him in the dirt, its steel darkened with ash, a tool of vengeance that had become a relic of survival. Mara dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands fluttered over his wounds, afraid to touch him for fear of finding him too broken to hold together. "You're still with us," she whispered, her voice a prayer as much as a statement of fact. Cole's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. The weariness in his eyes was softened by something new, something fragile and bright. "I told you," he rasped, his voice cracked and raw, but certain. "No child of yours would be left to the fire." At that, Ayla stepped forward. She clutched the little wooden wolf carving tight in her soot-stained hands. She looked at Cole, her small chin trembling, but her voice was steady as she whispered a single word. "Papa?" The word cut through the dawn, simple and small, but it struck like thunder in Cole's chest. His eyes closed, and a single tear traced a clean path down the grit on his cheek. He opened his arm. The little girl rushed into it, burying her face against his chest. Her younger sisters followed, pressing close, their small bodies clinging to his sides. Mara covered her mouth with shaking hands, tears of relief and gratitude spilling freely down her face. "They're yours now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You kept the vow." Cole drew a long, ragged breath. His hand rested heavy and protective on Ella's hair. His gaze lifted to meet Mara's. "Not just theirs," he said, his voice deep and certain, despite the pain that radiated from him. "Yours too. I won't leave you again. Not while I still draw breath." Her heart clenched. The years of beatings, of shame, of exile all crumbled away like the embers of the fire behind them. For the first time, she saw not just a savior, but a man standing in the ashes of his own profound grief, who had chosen to build something new out of the ruin. She reached for his bloodied hand, pressing it against her cheek, her tears wetting his skin. "Then we'll build it together," she said, her voice steady now, rooted in something stronger than fear. The girls nestled closer, their little hands clutching his coat, and Cole's chest swelled with a breath that was not just about pain, but about release. It was the first true breath of a man who was no longer chained to his past. Around them, the valley lay scarred, but it was alive. The morning sun was gilding the lingering smoke, turning it to gold. The Calder's power was broken, their patriarch lost to the fire he had worshipped. The land itself seemed to exhale with them, quiet and waiting. Cole looked out across the hills, his voice a low rumble. "This place took my family from me once. Now it gives me another." He pulled Mara and the girls closer, a broken, battered, beautiful, new family. The little wooden wolf carving glinted in Ela's small hand as the sun finally crowned the ridge. And in that light, with the ashes at their backs and the dawn before them, they were no longer a widow and a wanderer. They were no longer orphans and a broken man. They were a family bound not by blood, but by a vow forged in fire, sealed in love, ready to walk forward into the day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the map. Cole's choice to protect Mara and her daughters created a new family from the ashes of two broken ones. Do you believe family is something you're born into or something you build? Let's talk about it in the comments below.